I think reality finally caught up with the Chicago Bears in this 2015 season. They started off the season terribly. They weren't helped by the fact that the first three games were against the Green Bay Packers, Arizona Cardinals, and Seattle Seahawks, three playoff teams. But you got to a point in time in the middle portion of the season where the Bears were starting to play well under John Fox. They were being competitive. They were keeping games close. They were finding a way to win some games. And they were sitting there at 5-6, and fans were starting to wonder, hey, could this team potentially make a surprise playoff run? Is John Fox that much of a coaching guru? Is this team maybe a little bit better than what we've given them credit for? Well, we found out over the past 3 weeks the answer is no. They lose to the 49ers, they lose to the Redskins, and then they lose to the Minnesota Vikings. 5-9 is where the Bears currently sit. So no playoffs again. And a team that is showing just how far away they really are from being a contender in the NFC North, let alone the NFC, let alone a Super Bowl contender. This is a Bears team, as I've talked about, that is in a rebuilding mode and has needed to be in a rebuilding mode for years. And it seems like to me, to a certain degree, that the front office of the Chicago Bears under general manager Ryan Pace understands this. And you can tell based off of some of the personnel they've trotted out, especially on the defensive side of the ball in the 2015 season, that the Bears clearly understand how bare the talent cupboard is on the defensive side of the ball and just how far away they are and just how long they have to go. They're trying all different types of combinations, all different types of players. They're trying to see if something they throw up against the wall will freaking stick. And that's where they need to be at this point. This is a team that needs to be bad in order to be really good. I mean, let's face it, this is now the 5th straight year with no playoffs for this team. That's 5 straight seasons, no playoffs. Whereas the Green Bay Packers have made the playoffs every single year during that stretch. The Minnesota Vikings look like they'll make the playoffs again this year. Or this year, I should say. And the Detroit Lions have even made the playoffs twice over the past 5 years. But the Bears have been the one team in the NFC North that's been on the outside looking in. Part of the reason for that, especially now when you look at this roster in 2015, this is a team lacking in star power, a team lacking in impact players and difference makers. That's due to years of poor drafting, that's due to years of a dysfunctional philosophy of the front office and the coaching staffs of the Chicago Bears. It is the reality. But with that said, with that lack of impact player, with that lack of quality talent, there is opportunity there. That means there's opportunities for guys to step up and become those type of players. That means that the Bears don't have a ton of money invested in bad contracts. They're going to have plenty of salary cap space this upcoming offseason with some decent draft picks to work with. So all hope is not lost for the Chicago Bears organization. But even with the Bears in the current state that they're in, they still are going to face some tough decisions in terms of the roster that they have and players that they have to figure out whether they want to keep, or if they do want to keep, how important it is to keep them and how much of an investment they want to make with them. And to me, the biggest single question the Bears have heading into this offseason is whether or not they should re-sign Alshon Jeffrey. Now look, the former second-round pick in 2012 out of South Carolina hasn't always been my favorite Chicago Bear. You know that going back to draft day. There's been times where I've been very, very hard on him, sometimes justly and fairly, and sometimes not so much. And when you look at Alshon Jeffrey, he had a bad rookie season that was plagued by injuries and inconsistency, but he had a couple of really good years in the middle in 2013 and 2014. Hell, he made a Pro Bowl appearance. 80-plus catches, 1 year over 1,400 yards, another year over 1,000 yards. So if anything else, he showed himself to be one of the best number 2 wide receivers in all of the National Football League, playing on the other side of Brandon Marshall over the past 2 seasons. That's what you saw out of Alshon Jeffrey. You saw that talent. You've seen flashes. You've seen moments. You've seen glimpses of the type of talent that this guy possesses and the type of player that this guy can be. But ultimately, one of my biggest frustrations with Alshon Jeffrey is that for those moments, for those flashes of brilliance that you see, there's a lot of inconsistency, and flat out, there are just times where the guy just completely and totally disappears. He's very much a Jekyll and Hyde player to me. And when you look at the 2015 season that he has, it perfectly mirrors the career of Alshon Jeffrey to me in a lot of ways. It's very much a Jekyll and Hyde situation. He's been very, very good, if not great at times when he's played. But the problem is that he's missed several games due to injury, and he's had several other performances be impacted negatively based upon the lingering injuries that he's battled throughout the 2015 season. He has moments and flashes of brilliance, and then other times you're wondering where the hell this guy is. I point to this past Sunday's game against the Minnesota Vikings, a time where the Bears needed him to really step up. Marquise Wilson out for the year. Eddie Royal's been a nothing. Martellus Bennett on the IR. He's out for the year. This is a time, an opportunity for an Alshon Jeffrey to step up and show the type of player that he can be, the type of player that he should be in that passing game, as the clearly featured number one option in the passing game for Jay Cutler. And instead he has one catch for 10 yards and a touchdown. One catch. That's Alshon Jeffrey to me. Is when you think he's not going to do much, he explodes and has a huge game. But when they really need him to, and when they're depending upon him to be that guy, to be that number one difference maker, that factor maker on the outside, that X factor that everybody has to account for, he has one catch for 10 yards. It's frustrating because now we look at Alshon Jeffrey getting ready to head into the free agency period, and there's some important questions that I think this Bears organization has to ask themselves and they have to address. Can this team afford to lose him? You're talking about a guy that does potentially have number one wide receiver talent at the NFL level, but even if he's never that, he's still a really, really damn good number two wide receiver that at times can make some big-time explosive plays. He's a guy that one-on-one can be incredibly difficult to match up with. He's a guy that can go get a ball at its highest point, make some really, really tough catches, and he's a guy that can surprise you with his ability to stretch the field vertically. Those type of players just don't grow on trees all the time. So can the Bears really afford to lose him? Especially for a roster that is so devoid of talent as it is, does it make a lot of sense to lose a guy like Jeffrey, who is clearly one of the most physically talented players that you have on your entire roster on either side of the ball, for nothing? Just let him walk away to somebody else in free agency. Is that really a good way to rebuild your organization? Taking somebody who was actually drafted into the program, that has been developed in your program, and just let him go off and be more successful somewhere else. That's not a good building model for anybody in any organization. But at the same token, when you look at Alshon Jeffrey, his two best seasons in 2013 and 2014 came in large part because of the fact that he played on the other side of Brandon Marshall. Brandon Marshall was a clearly established number one. So Alshon Jeffrey's numbers were a bit misleading because he would have some really, really big games, but they came as a number two wide receiver when teams were double-teaming Brandon Marshall. They were shadowing coverage over to him. When Alshon Jeffrey's been expected this year to be the number one guy, he's either been hurt or he's been very inconsistent when he's been on the field. Do you really want to plunk Demaryius Thomas, Dez Bryant, A.J. Green, Julio Jones potential type of money into a guy like Alshon Jeffrey when he is not those guys? He is not better than any of those guys that I mentioned. He's not on that same level of any of those guys that I mentioned. He's a questionable at best number one wide receiver or a really, really good number two wide receiver. So do you want to pay a really, really good number two wide receiver great number one wide receiver money? Is that something that makes a whole lot of sense either? I don't know that it does. Does the Bears losing Alshon Jeffrey really make sense in terms of the rebuilding plan? And again, I don't know that it does because you need to build your teams through the draft. And Alshon Jeffrey was a guy that was drafted by this organization. So one of the better players that this organization has drafted, frankly, over the past 5 or 6 years, does it make sense for them to just let him potentially walk away for absolutely nothing? Knowing all the while that a team like Minnesota could come knocking on the door, a team in another division in the NFC could come knocking on the door. Does that really make sense? And what does it say if you allow a talented player like this to leave, knowing you have plenty of cap space and knowing that you have all types of questions at that wide receiver position outside of him? Kevin White, their first-round pick in 2015, didn't play at all this year because of the shin injury. I expect him to be a big-time difference maker once he gets on the field, but shit, he's got to get on the field first. Eddie Royal's been hurt most of the year, and when he has played, he's been wildly ineffective. Marquise Wilson You know, he's had an occasional glimpse, but nothing special. And he's most certainly not anybody you want to count on big time if you're any type of organization that wants to win in any type of way. So does letting him leave really make you a better team? But at the same point in time, you've had Alshon Jeffrey these past 4 years, and you've had him as your number one here in 2015, and you're sitting at 5-9. You haven't made the playoffs at all the entire time that you've had Alshon Jeffrey. So frankly, does keeping him really make a difference? Does it really matter? You know, are you in a position where you want to pay this guy big time money? I don't know. You know, is he a guy that if you lose, you're that much worse off for? I don't know. Because they're not that good of a team to begin with. Their offense really isn't that consistently good to begin with. And if anything, Alshon Jeffrey, along with guys like Jay Cutler and so forth, represents the inconsistency of that Bears offense. It's a talent tease. They'll kind of snuggle the undercarriage of your nuts by making you think that they're a whole lot better on a more consistent basis than they actually are. You have games of great potential greatness, and then you'll have games of absolute suck and disappointment and disappearance. So, I mean, I'm looking at it and I'm saying for a team that's already 5-9, where has Alshon Jeffrey made that much of a difference this year to this team consistently enough to where we could say he was responsible for 1, 2, or 3 wins, or that they'd be any better or worse off without him? I just don't know. So when it comes to the fundamental question of should the Bears re-sign Alshon Jeffrey, I say this. Am I willing to give him, if I'm Ryan Pace, the general manager, a big-time 4- or 5-year deal with a lot of guarantee money that pays him like a big-time number 1 wide receiver? Absolutely fucking not. Because this was his contract year. And if he couldn't even have a big-time season when he's supposed to be the number 1 guy in his contract year, if anything, that's when you expect guys to have the biggest years of their careers in the contract years because they're trying to get paid. And all the while, Alshon Jeffrey can't stay fucking healthy. And you can say what you want about that, but at the end of the day, this is a business. And do you want to invest huge money into an injury risk, potentially like an Alshon Jeffrey? Do you want to sit there and pay him like a number 1, expecting him to be a number 1 when he's better suited being a really, really good number 2? Do you want to pay him great number 1 wide receiver money or really, really good number 2 wide receiver money? And if Alshon Jeffrey goes into free agency, you're probably going to have some team that'd be willing to outbid you with a ton of salary cap space that would be willing to pay him like a really, really good, if not great, number 1 wide receiver. Do you really need to overpay to keep this guy? I don't think that it makes a lot of sense at this point. I think it makes a lot of sense for the Bears to apply their franchise tag to Alshon Jeffrey and limit his ability to negotiate with other teams, give the Chicago Bears organization some potential leverage in negotiating a long-term deal, and in the meantime, give themselves a cost certainty for 2016 where they give Alshon Jeffrey even maybe another chance to have a prove-it season. Say, you know, we'll give you another chance to show us you're the number 1 wide receiver. And if you are the number 1 wide receiver and you are a big-time number 1 wide receiver, we're going to pay you as such after the 2016 season. That, to me, is the answer. Re-signing him to a long-term deal right now doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Giving him a 1-year deal as the franchise tag player makes a lot of sense for the organization. Gives Jeffrey another contract year to try and prove himself again. It gives the Bears 1 more year where they don't have to have a big-time contract on the books that they're committed to for a lot of years. You know, it gives you a chance to see what he would do with Kevin White on the field next year potentially. I just think from a negotiating standpoint, from a sensibility standpoint, from a long-term salary cap standpoint, the best move for the Bears to make is to franchise tag Alshon Jeffrey. I'd be opposed to them letting him walk in free agency to somebody else because, again, at the end of the day, if you're an organization that's trying to rebuild and rebuild through the draft like the Bears are, like they need to be, like they have to be, letting somebody that you've drafted, one of your best talented players, walk away for nothing makes absolutely no sense and smacks in the face of all logic of rebuilding through the draft to fucking begin with. The Bears don't have a lot of good players. That's the simple fact of the matter. They need to keep whatever good players that they have that make sense. Alshon Jeffrey is a good player, and he can make sense, but it's got to be right. The franchise tag is right. A long-term deal at this point is not.